Welcome to Your Success Podcast. We give you actionable insight and stories behind real-life success wherever you go. Here are your hosts, Angelos and Mo.
The following episode is our chat with Ian Fowler from Savills, who we chatted to about the RICS Red Book Valuation process and how important it is in the property development world. Enjoy.
So, Ian Fowler from Savills, thank you for joining us on Your Success Podcast today. We're going to get straight into the questions. So, first up, what is RICS and why does it matter?
So, RICS is the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. The reason it matters is because we are a regulatory body to set industry standards for anybody involved in property or needing advice in respect of chartered surveyors and property generally.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you.
So, I guess, Ian, why do people need a RICS valuation rather than just taking the opinion of an estate agent?
So the RICS introduced what's called the Red Book back in the sort of late 1970s. And the reason was to regulate the way that advice is given for anybody relying on that for a purpose. So a Red Book valuation really is for anything that involves a transaction where the advice is being used to securitize a property or pay your tax or assess some other form of business or shareholder transaction.
So then are there certain standards, criteria that everyone has a common...
Yes, so it's there for the protection of the public and for clients so that everybody gets a standardised level of advice. And the Red Book actually is mandatory in some respects in that it tells us not how to value, but it tells us the process we need to follow to make sure that those standards are set out for everybody the same.
And so, are there any of those that you could share in terms of what's the certain standards or process that you have to go through in arriving at a valuation?
So I suppose the biggest one at the moment and the biggest change we've seen in the last few months is about conflicts of interest. Okay. So you can't provide an independent valuation if you're deemed to have a conflict of interest. So any prior involvement or current involvement in the property you're being asked to assess that could cause you to have a non-independent view.
So, yeah, if a family member was...
Exactly, a family member, or if you're selling the same asset as you're valuing, that kind of relationship. But it goes a bit beyond that in terms of the new regulation now, because it is important to make sure that everybody acts independently and impartially.
Yeah. So, for example, if you have this really quirky commercial building, right, and estate agents are giving you massively different valuations, one's 1 million, one's 2 million, that's a massive difference, right? How does a RICS valuer have the standards, maybe a bit of experience as well, to determine what is the actual value of this building where there's this 1 million difference in valuation?
So estate agent's job is obviously to price the market to sell, price the asset to sell in the market. So they set a benchmark or a strike price, and that could be either a plus or a minus when the deal is actually concluded. A valuer's job is to try and anticipate where it would sit in the market. And the way we go about that is we look at comparable evidence and transactions of similar assets that have sold in the same area, ideally. But at the end of the day, there's a process you go through, but it can also be a bit of a judgment call. Based on your experience, your knowledge of the area and your general expertise, you stand back and do the sort of sense check of, would I pay this for that asset? And it is based really on just the collation of that primary data and your analysis of it subsequent to. And it can be a difficult process to go through. It's pretty tough at the moment in some sectors being a valuer. When the market doesn't trade and you don't have up-to-date evidence, it can be very challenging. And we were there, a decade ago. It was a very difficult job.
Yeah. And how does the liability work? If you're valuing something, you're saying it's a development project and you're valuing what the units are going to be worth, in 12, 18, 24 months. Is there any pushback from either the lender or from the developers themselves to say, well, you valued it at this price and we haven't been able to achieve that? Or
the valuer's job is to arrive at a day one value. We can't value into the future because no one knows what's going to happen in the future. And we can only arrive at an opinion as at that date. Okay. Now, yes, valuers, of course, do come under scrutiny, particularly when things go wrong. The valuer's job is to make sure that they've articulated at the time the position as they understand it to be, and they're shown to have arrived at that in a reasoned way that any other valuer would have arrived at a similar opinion. There is a valuation tolerance that's generally sort of set through case law and where there have been settlements of claims. But, there's no over-reliance on that in terms of what you can and can't get away with. You have to arrive at a reasoned opinion and you have to prove you've done it in a competent way. And that's really where the Red Book comes in. Right. Because if you haven't followed the guidance in the Red Book, then you're immediately criticised for not having undertaken the process properly. And, there are questions then raised about whether actually you're competent enough to have reported it in the first place.
I guess that's why the valuations can take a while to write up, and you think, you went round and had a look at the site on Tuesday. It should be with us by the Friday, but there's so much to it actually that goes into that report. That's why.
And they're putting their neck on the line,
yeah,
ultimately, aren't they?
Well, you do take some responsibility. You can't provide a formal valuation unless you've got a PI insurance behind you, but, the PI insurers are not just going to pay out willy-nilly. You've got to prove that you've been through the process, and any other valuer would have arrived at the same job, at the same position. Yeah. In which case, there's very little to criticise the valuer. It is a factor of the market then if something tanks, and people don't get their money back.
Talking of tanking, Brexit. No. What a great lead in there! Brilliant. You set that up nicely. I know it's a difficult question for anyone to answer at this point. But how do you see Brexit affecting the market next year? Are lenders asking surveyors to be more cautious with their valuations?
There's obviously a huge amount of commentary at the moment, again, about what may or may not happen in March, and there's volatility in the sector as a consequence of that. We have seen some developers and house builders coming back and saying actually they're going to pause for a moment just to see what happens. I think there's been an element of pricing already in our market as a consequence of this over the last couple of years, and there certainly was in the lead up to the vote, albeit the market did slow and certain trades didn't happen, but actually from a pricing perspective, some of it was already in the system. Just to be clear, banks don't ask valuers to be cautious in their valuations. That's not our job. What banks are increasingly asking of valuers is that we look beyond the short term. And there is more of an impact now on lending decisions based on how you can see liquidity in the market, past trends, future trends, where that product sits relative to second-hand stock. And it's really about commentary and perspective and anticipating that longer game now than actually saying to a valuer, you've got to take 10% off because of Brexit. That we've never been asked that. We are never asked that. We're asked to do our job, which is to report the value at the day we're asked to do it, based on the evidence we have in front of us. But that longer term commentary is becoming increasingly important.
And then it's the commentary that the banks use internally to assess against their risk appetite.
Yeah, valuers don't assess risk. Yeah. Valuers can advise on where the risks may be, but ultimately it's down to the lender to assess the risk. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So this podcast is all about success. It's called Your Success Podcast. And as such, we ask everyone we interview, what does the word success mean to you?
So in terms of what I do on a day-to-day basis, success for me is actually knowing that I'm giving my client the best advice, whether they want to hear that or not, and that as a consequence of that, they actually succeed in their own decision-making. And of course, success isn't always about going up. Sometimes your best successes are your losses. And, to me, that is really what this is all about. 19 years in the industry, I have given advice that people haven't liked to hear, but on reflection, they have come back and said, actually, that was one of the best things that anybody said to me.
You saved us a lot of money. Yeah,
indeed.
Yeah. Brilliant. So, Ian, how did people get in contact with you?
So you can go onto Savills' website. There's a very easy search tool on there. So you can search me up there. You can search me on the RICS website as a registered valuer. That's probably your best source. I am on LinkedIn as well, if you need to find me there.
Brilliant.
So thank you for joining us, Ian. And we look forward to your presentation at the Developers Conference.
No problem. Thanks. Thank you.
You have been listening to Your Success Podcast. Click subscribe for more incredible content. More details can be found at www.yoursuccesspodcast.com.